The Meeker Incident, one of the last Indian uprisings in America. Starting in 1850, white Americans from the East had begun making the first settlements within Colorado. These settlers named the area Colorado, meaning the color red in Spanish because of the red rock formations and sediment the Colorado River washed away from the mountains. Over time, the white Americans stretched their settlements even further westward into Colorado, creating some of Colorado's oldest towns such as Idaho Springs, Canyon City, Greeley, and up into the area of what would eventually be the town of Meeker. Here, the white settlers encountered natives who lived there along the way. There were tensions between them, which led to what would be eventually known as the Meeker Incident. In the end, the white settlers were victorious, and thus pushed the Utes onto reservations. The white settlers' success and the Utes' failure in the Meeker Incident created a turning point in western Colorado because it allowed for the creation of the town of Meeker, expansion further westward, and was a factor in the ending of the Utes' traditional ways of life, as it was one of the final Indian uprisings in the U.S. When settlers first explored the area of where Meeker, Colorado would be, they noticed that the area had unique lands they had not seen before. There were bright, shining mountains all around, marvelous spruce trees as tall as the sky, and a river. The river had lush vegetation on its shores and was a beautiful sight. The white settlers called this river the White River, even though they did not realize that the Utes already called this river Smoking River. They speculated that these lands would be a nice place to settle, but little did they know that the Utes living before them were not very fond of sharing the land. As early as the first few days, the settlers realized that negotiating with the Utes would not be a simple task. The Utes had claimed the land long before the white settlers, and had stayed there by themselves for years, and they intended for it to stay that way. To help end these conflicts, Frederick Walker Pitkin, the current governor of Colorado at the time, who was campaigning on a theme of "the Utes must go," created the White River Agency. This agency would help the Utes to learn and practice the settlers' customs, in hopes that it would settle the conflicts. Pitkin appointed Nathan Cook Meeker, the founder of Greeley, Colorado, to be the Utes' agent. Meeker, who lacked experience with the natives, decided to teach them how to farm and practice Christianity. The Utes did not give in to Meeker's undiplomatic demands to make them farm, become Christians, go to school, and discontinue their horse racing and hunting forays. Over time, the tensions only got worse. On September 29, 1879, Meeker stated that he was assaulted by a subchief during a petty quarrel, so the government asked for 150 soldiers led by Major Thomas T. Thornburg, commander of Fort Steele in Wyoming, to end the tensions between the settlers and the Utes in a raging battle. Eventually, Thornburg's soldiers had arrived at Mill Creek, a piece of land within Ute territory. It was illegal for Thornburg's forces to cross into Ute territory, but the troops' horses were thirsty, and there so happened to be a river nearby. Thus, Thornburg illegally marched his forces onto the land in spite of the consequences. No one knows who fired the first shot, but once Thornburg's soldiers entered Ute territory, the battle had begun. It raged on for hours until Thornburg's forces were weakened. 28 men were wounded, and 13 men had been killed, including Thornburg. The remaining men called in reinforcements from the government. The Utes had the upper hand and were keeping the soldiers held captive, but when Pitkin asked the military for 100 more soldiers, the Utes became overwhelmed. However, they were not yet ready to give up. I am here today at the site of the Battle of Mill Creek. Behind me is the creek where Major Thornburg crossed his army into Ute territory to begin the battle. It was then when the first shot was made. Meanwhile, a group of Ute Indian braves aimed to attack the White River Agency, which led to what was considered the true Meeker Incident. The Utes killed Nathan Meeker and several of his workers. The Utes kidnapped Meeker's wife, daughter, and another child, holding them captive until the battle was over. Although many white Americans died, several Utes died in the fighting as well. Overwhelmed, the Utes finally surrendered on October 5th, 1879. As of surrendering, the Utes were forced off onto reservations in Utah. This turning point allowed the Utes to never again live on the lands of their original home of Colorado by the bright, shining mountains, lush grass, and White River, which they called Smoking River. Coincidentally, the Utes' leader, Chief Ouray, had also recently passed away from Bright's disease during the negotiations of where the Utes would be moved to. I am here today at Powell Park, where the White River Agency was located back in 1879. It was here where the actual Meeker incident occurred. After much traveling, the Utes arrived in Unitah, Utah, a reservation where they would spend the rest of their days. Life there was difficult for the Utes, as they were unable to follow their traditional ways of life. They were unfamiliar with this area, so they did not know where to look for food and water. The land was dry and did not have very much lush vegetation. It was nothing like the bright shining mountains of Colorado and Smoking River. Over time, Indians from all across the U.S. adapted to the modern-day living styles. There are some Indians out there, however, that still practice their traditional ways of life, but there are only very few. While things weren't looking good for the Utes, things were looking good for the settlers. Their success in the Meeker incident created a turning point because it allowed them to expand their settlements further westward and build the town of Meeker, which we know today. I am here today at the White River Museum, and all of these buildings used to be the White River military camps. If you follow me inside here, I will show you a few pieces of history about the Meeker incidents. I'm here with Teresa Reed, the director of the Historical Society. Could you please tell us a little bit about these buildings?
Well, sure. The buildings were built shortly after the Meeker incident, which was in 1879, in the fall of 1879. The buildings are all built out of cottonwood logs that came from the river. And they started with the corner and then continued on. This was a parade ground right outside our door. The buildings were built one by one by the U.S. Army for the housing of the officials that needed to come here to figure out what to do next, and the military itself. There were actually 5 buildings. There are only 3 remaining, and the Historical Society is housed in 2 of those buildings. Our collection is over 250,000 items, and everything here is related to our community and the progression of our community as a community.
Right here is a printed picture depicting the Meeker incident, and some people in history used to call it the Meeker Massacre, but we actually call it the Meeker Incident because the youths themselves didn't consider the incident to be an entire massacre because not enough people were killed during the fighting. If you can understand how important ponies were to the Utes, then you can understand why they were so angry when Nathan C. Meeker ordered that their racetrack must be plowed up and that all of their horses should be killed. This here is the actual plow that Nathan C. Meeker ordered Shalbert Price to plow up the Utes pony racetrack with. Throughout the course of human history, cultures have collided and battles have ensued. In the fall of 1879, such a clash occurred between the Ute Indians and the white settlers. This conflict changed the course of history for the Ute culture and for Meeker, Colorado.